I've always loved flags. I remember one time my dad and I took a trip to Morocco, and we wanted to go to this waterfall, but we took a wrong turn on the way down, and we kind of had to trek down the mountain to get there. It was a very fun experience with my dad, but somehow the largest takeaway I had from this was that I saw the New Caledonian flag out in the wilds, more specifically the Kanak flag. I still have no idea why it was there. The flag of a French colony north of Australia in the middle of the Atlas Mountains of Morocco is one of the stranger things I've seen, but I hope this little anecdote is enough to solidify you of my obsession. I think it comes from the fact that they're just pieces of fabric, but they represent so much. They represent people, they represent countries, they represent communities. To me, they're the most powerful symbols of all. But that may not necessarily be a good thing. Before we look at that nuance that they carry, let's take a little look into their history. Whilst we don't know exactly when flags were invented, we can break down their history into two main sections of use: communication and representation. The first instances of banners being used, not quite flags, was all the way in the 11th century BCE in ancient Chinese dynasties, or starting around the Zhou dynasty. Unfortunately, the earliest lasting evidence we have of this is on the tomb of the Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty, dating to all the way into 11th century BCE. And it's hard to see on this image, but I assure you it's there. The Romans also just started doing similar things around 100 BCE. Unfortunately, only one of these vexillum, as they were called, survived, and is housed in the Museum of Fine Arts in Russia, and its validity is heavily debated. But here's a recreation of what they may have looked like. The basic takeaway from this is that flags were originally just used for communication and differentiation in war. Eventually, however, they took on a new meaning: identity. The Islamic dynasties were some of the first to adopt flags to represent their empires. They were usually just solid colors derived from the black standard flown by Muhammad during his conquest of Mecca, and this was even seen up until recently when the Libyan flag was just a solid green color. Now, as we move towards Europe, the first time flags were used to represent individual identities there was all the way into the 12th century. Heraldry had become very popular, and for those uneducated on medieval knight nomenclature, heraldry, according to my favorite source, Wikipedia, is a discipline relating to the design, display, study, and transmission of armorial bearings. To simplify that a bit, one example of this was freelance knights, as they were called, would have symbols, coats of arms, on their lances or shields, and that would eventually evolve into flags, likely for more long-range visibility. And this could even be seen on the Spanish flag, as the coat of arms is just thrown on there. So you can educate yourself on heraldic terms, here's a glossary for you. There will be a quiz at the end. Moving on from heraldry, which we all love, if we're talking about national flags, I believe the prince's flag is likely one of the oldest flags, dating to around the 1500s. It was used to symbolize wonderful Dutch patriotism as we rose up against our Spanish oppressors, led by our prince Willem van Oranje, or Willem of Orange, for those not yet to see the orange lights. And don't worry, my Dutch blood is only slightly influencing that statement. Technically speaking, the Danish and English flags are older, dating to the 13th and 12th centuries respectively. But the prince's flag is also noteworthy for breaking the cycle of crosses signifying nations, because the Danish flag is just the Dannebrog cross, and the English flag is just the St. George's cross. Those flags were originally just religious symbols, and only later were they adopted as national flags. But there's still certainly an argument to be made that they still count as the oldest flags, even if they weren't originally intended as such. And as a side note, please note how we, the Dutch, were the first to coin the idea of a tricolor striped flag, so take that, everyone else. I suggest you change it to face the shame. Moving on from this complicated history and my biased Dutch blood, we can see that as a society, we've always tended towards finding ways to represent ourselves with symbols, and oftentimes then flags. And sometimes the symbols can become more powerful than what they actually represent. And this doesn't just apply to flags. It applies to everything from religious symbols like crosses, crescents, and stars of David, to brand logos. But why is this? I believe it's due to a few main reasons. Firstly, we like to oversimplify. Symbols are nuanced and they tell stories, but that's only if you really dig deeper into their meaning. What they do on a base level is evoke an emotion. You don't need to know the whole history, you just need to know the symbol and a bit of its meaning. Take the Imperial Japanese flag. I doubt that everyone in this room knows everything about the Japanese war machine in the Second World War. What I can reasonably confidently say is that more people will know this flag than that whole story, particularly if they grew up around wartime in America. And when they see this flag, an emotion is brought up. They're designed to evoke emotions, and they do a darn good job at that. Simple colors and shapes facilitate an immediate emotional response, kind of like how colored snakes will likely be venomous, carrying a "do not mess with me" message. On the other hand, a face, a fact, and a quote need a lot more thinking to register, kind of like how nowadays a photo of Hitler says less to people than a swastika. Our brains are hardwired to simplify, and it's a lot easier to draw a conclusion about some lines than a complex person, even if at the end of the day, the lines aren't at fault, the person is. Flags can also be reused. Symbols have the ability to be interpreted and reinterpreted over and over, bringing new ideas to light over time. Take the Union Jack. Up until the 80s, the flag had a strong association with right-wing nationalism, but nowadays, it's far less political to most. But flags can also literally evolve over time. Take the American flag as it gained stars over time as more states joined the Union. Flags can even have a split meaning and a lot of nuance to them. Take the Confederacy. Particularly during the American Civil War, in the North, the flag was a symbol of racism and slavery, but in the South, it represented simple patriotism and identity. And this connotation lives on even today. I remember listening to a podcast during the quarantine, and it was around that time that Mississippi was in their final vote to change their state flag from one that contained the Confederate flag to one that didn't. And that podcast, called Radiolab, by the way, told the story of a black high school cheerleader and how they were supposed to carry that Confederate-having flag onto a football field before the game. And there was a line that struck me in that. It said, "For a black person like John to carry that flag, the Confederate flag, onto the field before the game is like a Jewish person carrying a swastika." I touched briefly upon the connotations of a swastika, but clearly these connotations can last a lot longer than 80 years, even if it was used to signify peace for centuries as a Buddhist symbol. It's the strong political association that really lasts with people. In other words, a symbol for peace says less to us than a symbol for war. And even the flag of the rising sun, once again. To an American, it brings back sour memories of World War II with Japanese imperialism. A Korean or Chinese person may find it to bring back much more severe trauma with memories of slavery and massacre. Yet, from the perspective of someone Japanese, they may find it to be a lot more nuanced. As depending on their place on the political spectrum and their education, they may interpret it as anything from their Navy's flag to a cultural symbol to a memory of their atrocity-filled past. So, after all of this, I have to ask, is all this power a bit too much? At the end of the day, they're just pieces of fabric, aren't they? And if we're saluting them and burning them, do they have too much power over us? Well, me being the flag lover that I am, I'm inclined to say no. Sure, they can tear us apart, but they bring us together. They show us who we are, and perhaps more importantly, who we were. When I decided to talk about flags for this talk, I had two main ideas. I could have talked about the real vexillological aspect of what this color represents and why, or how this shape or aspect ratio invokes this emotion. But that's not as informative and realistic. Just because, not to talk about the specific colors of this flag and shapes of another, because that's not the meaning of it. It's a lot more nuanced than that. Just because some revolutionaries in the late 1700s said that the red, white, and blue of the tricolor represented liberté, égalité, and fraternité, pardon my French, doesn't mean that's what it actually means now. The flag is what people make of it. Just the nuance and allegiance comes from that nuance. The mob can change the meaning of a flag, or a smaller controversial group can, kind of like with the swastika. The nuance and the conflict literally are the meaning. So, are they just pieces of fabric? Perhaps. But what they really are complicated, nuanced symbols that can tear us apart and bring us together all at the same time. Thank you.